My family said I was being dramatic. But how would you feel if your own sister hijacked your wedding, stole the spotlight in a white gown, and your parents told you to stop making everything about yourself? I didn't cry. I didn't chase them. I disappeared. And while they mocked me for running away, I built an empire. When I returned as the owner of their precious ocean crest, their faces collapsed in real time. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning light at Seabreeze Estate hit the mirror in front of me with a sharpness that didn't match the warmth California was supposed to promise. It was barely 8, the ocean outside was calm, the sky clear, everything looking like the picture-perfect beginning of a wedding day. Except it didn't feel like mine. I sat in the bridal suite staring at myself in the full-length mirror, trying to steady my breath, while the silk of my dress pooled around my feet. I traced the edge of the lace bodice with my fingertips, telling myself I should feel excited, grateful something. But all I felt was a quiet knot, twisting tighter in my stomach. I thought about the past weeks of planning all those moments when my voice had been drowned out by someone else's opinion. Mostly my mother's. Every time I tried to choose something small, the flowers, or the menu, or even the chairs, she reminded me what our family's standard required. I had learned to nod to let her feel in control, to tell myself the wedding was just one day. One day I could get through. One day where I didn't have to fight. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. Before I could answer, my mother, Elaine Caldwell, swept into the room. She wore a pearl suit perfectly pressed, her hair pinned in the classic chignon she insisted women of standing maintained. She didn't look at my face, not even for a moment. She went straight for the veil, adjusting it as if I were a mannequin needing correction. "Hold still," she murmured. "You didn't place this right. It needs to fall softer. You know the photographers will be everywhere today." Her fingers were quick, practiced, but cold on my shoulders. I watched her reflection as she moved around me, never meeting my eyes. The feeling of being invisible settled in my chest like a stone. "It's fine, Mom," I whispered. She ignored that. "Try not to fidget. You get nervous too easily." Before I could say anything more, a heavier set of footsteps echoed in the hallway. My father's unmistakable stride. The door cracked open, and he stuck his head in without slowing his pace. "Harper, whatever you do today, don't overdo it," he said, already halfway down the hall again. "Keep it elegant. Don't make a scene." The door shut behind him. He hadn't even looked inside. My throat tightened. I stared at the closed door for a moment, then back at myself in the mirror. A bride should feel cherished, held, celebrated. I felt like a burden someone forgot to set down. Guests began to arrive earlier than expected. I heard the clatter of heels on the hallway tiles, the murmur of distant greetings, glasses clinking, even though the bar it wasn't supposed to open yet. Every sound crept under my skin. The suite felt smaller and smaller. I closed my eyes, forced a slow inhale, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't give. Then, the door swung open again. "Oh my God, you're not ready yet." A voice sang out, bright and dripping with self-importance. "Madison," my sister waltzed in as if she owned the place, her perfume rushing ahead of her. I opened my eyes and froze. She was wearing white. Not ivory, not champagne, not off-white, white. A floor-length beaded corset gown that glittered like she had dipped herself in the spotlight. The train swept behind her like she was the one walking down the aisle. For a moment, the room tilted. I couldn't speak. She spun in front of the mirror, arching her back, tilting her head, pouting, as if a camera were aimed at her. She ran her hands down her waist, admiring herself with a grin. "What do you think?" she asked, not to me, but to the entire room as if a crowd were watching. I figured I'd go all out. It's a special day for all of us. My mother gasped, not in shock, but in delight. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, clasping her hands together. "You look radiant, truly angelic." My father's voice drifted in from the hallway. "Is that Madison?" "She looks incredible." He walked in, eyes widening in admiration. "That's my girl." No one looked at me. No one acknowledged the fact that I was sitting there in my wedding dress watching my sister steal the entire morning, with a gown designed to outshine any bride. I swallowed hard. The air felt thin. My palms grew chapped as my heartbeat thudded in my ears. "Madison." I finally managed my voice barely audible. "Why are you wearing that?" She glanced at me only long enough to give a dismissive smile. "Relax, Harper. It's just fashion. You'll still have your moment." She turned back to the mirror. "Besides, everyone knows I photograph better. The pictures will look great." The knot in my stomach twisted painfully. My mother adjusted Madison's shoulder strap, still ignoring me. My father nodded approvingly, like he was witnessing something important, something monumental. And there I was, sitting alone, in the center of the bridal suite that suddenly didn't belong to me, swallowed by a room full of people who had forgotten who the bride was. I tried taking another breath, but it caught in my chest instead. My pulse quickened, my fingertips tingled. I pressed my hands into my lap to keep them steady. That was the moment I understood that this morning wasn't mine. It had never been mine. And if I didn't hold myself together, I was going to disappear completely. I looked back at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back with wide, uncertain eyes, the veil slipping slightly to one side again. Behind me, Madison sparkled under the lights, laughing with our mother. My father clapped once, calling someone in the hall to come take a look. Someone else's celebration was happening here. Someone else's moment. Someone else's wedding. And I was standing in the middle of it, fading quietly, realizing that the day I had imagined for years was being rewritten right in front of me, with me written out of the script. I straightened my spine, forcing my shoulders back. The room was buzzing, but my mind started to still. If this was how the day would begin, I already knew how it would end. I just didn't know how soon. The garden behind Seabreeze Estate buzzed with a warm ocean breeze and the chatter of early guests as I stepped onto the stone path leading toward the ceremony lawn. Rows of white chairs faced the bluff overlooking the Pacific sunlight, scattering across the waves like shattered glass. It should have looked magical. Instead, the second my shoes touched the edge of the aisle, I felt dozens of eyes slide past me and land somewhere else. "Is that the bride?" someone whispered. "No, I think that's her sister," another voice replied, followed by a light laugh that stung sharper than the wind. I didn't need to turn around to know they were looking at Madison. Her glittering white gown practically threw beams of light across the lawn. She stood near the floral arch, posing with her chin tilted up in a perfect angle, one hand on her hip. A photographer snapped away eagerly, not because he was instructed to, but because she demanded attention in a way I never learned to. I walked slower, hoping no one would see how my stomach twisted inside me. Every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into someone else's celebration. "Let's get one more with the arch behind you," Madison told the photographer, brushing a curl behind her ear. Before the ceremony had even begun, she had already taken over the entire pre-wedding photo session. My mother Elaine waved the photographer down. "Sweetheart, can you do a few more shots of my eldest?" "The lighting is perfect right now." She didn't spare me a single glance. Her voice rose proudly. "This dress deserves to be captured from every angle." The photographer hesitated, glancing between the two of us, but she gestured sharply, and he obeyed. I lingered near the edge of the gathering, unsure where to stand. My father, Walter, was shaking hands with a group of business acquaintances near the aisle. From a distance, I watched him gesture toward Madison with a look of pride so familiar it almost didn't register anymore. "That's my daughter," he said. "Not the bride. Not today." I swallowed hard and moved closer to the family group, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could blend into the photos, share at least one moment that belonged to me. The photographer lifted his camera again, and I stepped into the frame. "Harper, honey." "You're blocking the sunset," my mother said, instantly placing her hand lightly on my arm and nudging me aside. Not harshly, just firmly enough to erase any place I thought I had. I backed out of the frame, my cheeks burning. The photographer didn't even lower the camera. He just shifted slightly, following my mother's cue, placing Madison dead center between both our parents. It didn't matter what my wedding dress looked like, or that it was supposed to be my day. All the lenses in the world were pointed at her. I turned away before they could see the moisture building in my eyes. I didn't want to be captured like that, crying in the corner of my own celebration. The wedding coordinator approached me with a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Mrs. Caldwell." She stopped when she recognized me. "I mean, Miss Caldwell. Sorry. Are you ready to line up?" She didn't know my new last name. I hadn't changed it legally yet, another reminder of all the unfinished pieces of my life. "Yes," I said, though my voice didn't feel like my own. Guests began to settle into their seats. The music started, soft strings, the kind of soundtrack that should have felt romantic. Instead, each note sounded like it echoed off a hollow place inside me. As I moved toward the aisle entrance, I caught more whispers. "She's pretty, but something's off. Maybe she's nervous. Isn't the sister wearing white too?" It's confusing. Confusing. That word clung to me. I stood behind the tall cypress tree meant to shield the bride before the walk, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. My pulse thudded against my ribs. Then the ceremony host stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please rise for our beautiful bride, Madison Caldwell." The name shot through me like a physical blow. A wave of murmurs spread across the audience. A few people clapped automatically. My mother gasped, covering her mouth dramatically, but not out of shock, almost as if she were flattered by the mistake. Madison laughed lightly, brushing it off as if it were the most natural mix-up in the world. "Oops," the host stammered. "My apologies, folks, but the damage was done." The crowd's eyes flicked between us, and I felt myself shrinking inside my own skin. I stepped forward out of sheer instinct, desperate to salvage any sense of grounding. But before I could reach the aisle, Madison glided past me and snatched the microphone straight from the host's hand. "Actually," she said, smiling sweetly, "today is very special for both of us. My sister and I have been through so much together, and I just want to take a moment to celebrate this big milestone as a family." Family. As if she hadn't just hijacked the spotlight from me in front of 100 guests. I was rooted to the ground. My legs refused to move. My voice stuck in my throat. The photographer took advantage of the moment, snapping another burst of photos of Madison, holding the microphone like she belonged on the stage. My father clapped approvingly. My mother dabbed her eyes as if Madison's speech was touching rather than deeply inappropriate. I watched the way the sun hit her gown, how the sequins reflected in every direction, how everyone looked at her like she was the center of all light. And I realized then that maybe she had always been, at least in their world. My world was somewhere else entirely. The officiant tried to regain control of the ceremony, gently taking back the microphone. But the damage was done. The guests were still talking. The spell was broken. My day had been rewritten, reassigned, repurposed, as a stage for someone else's performance. As the music restarted, and the guests finally settled, I stepped into the aisle with a numb calm settling over me. I walked slowly toward the front, not because I was savoring the moment, but because I wasn't sure the ground would stay steady if I moved faster. By the time I reached the altar, I felt hollow. The world around me was still vibrant, the ocean breeze, the crisp sunlight, the flowers, but inside something had dimmed. Somewhere deep down I could feel the first crack in a foundation I hadn't realized was already breaking. And standing there beneath the arch, I knew I was barely visible in the picture of my own wedding. I slipped behind the ceremony arch as the officiant tried to steer the program back on track, but Madison's voice still carried through the speakers, bright, confident, ringing with the kind of ease only someone certain the world adored them could ever possess. The guests laughed at something she said loud enough that it echoed under the canopy. Each laugh stretched like a rubber band snapping against my skin. I stood in the narrow space behind the backdrop, hidden between crates of extra floral arrangements and a stack of unused chairs. The air smelled like eucalyptus and roses, but it all felt suffocating. Madison's voice rose again, thanking everyone for coming, talking about family milestones and shared journeys, none of which had anything to do with my marriage vows. I pressed my hand against the wall to stay steady. A young staff member from Seabreeze Estate rounded the corner, nearly bumping into me. She jumped, startled. "Oh, hi," she said, glancing at my dress, then back toward the ceremony lawn. "Are you helping the bride?" The words hit so hard my eyes stung. "No," I said quietly. "I'm the bride." Her mouth fell open. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I thought... She's wearing..." She stopped, flustered, cheeks red. I didn't realize. "It's fine." My voice barely made it out. She scurried away, mortified. I stayed where I was, letting the moment settle like dust over everything I thought I knew. When I finally stepped far enough to see through the narrow window carved into the back of the wooden partition, my heart dropped. My parents had moved to the side of the lawn, with Madison guiding her from table to table, introducing her to guests with the same pride they used to reserve for graduations, awards, life achievements. She shook hands confidently, smiling wide. Flashbulbs popped. Someone lifted a champagne glass toward her. No one asked where I was. No one even noticed I wasn't there. My chest tightened as I watched my mother lean toward a pair of guests, hand cupped to her mouth, in that familiar whisper she used when she wanted to control a narrative. "Harper gets a little sensitive about big events," she murmured with an apologetic smile. "Madison just shines naturally. Cameras love her. The guest nodded sympathetically, glancing at Madison with admiration. My mother didn't realize I could see her. Or maybe she did, and didn't care. Something cracked inside me. Not loudly, more like the quiet snap of a tiny thread holding too much weight. I stepped back into the shadows, the world suddenly muffled. My breathing grew shallow as the realization settled deeper. This wasn't my wedding anymore. This wasn't my moment, my ceremony, my beginning. It was theirs. It had always been theirs. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. Without thinking, I reached up and unhooked the delicate veil from my hair. It slid off in a single, whisper-thin motion, falling over my arm like the discarded skin of a creature that had outgrown it. Next came the jeweled hairpins, each one tugging slightly as I pulled them out, my hair loosening with every breath. Then I glanced toward the stone steps leading up from the ceremony lawn. My white heels gleamed against the sunlight, a symbol I suddenly wanted nothing to do with. I slipped them off one by one and placed them neatly at the base of the steps. Something about leaving them there felt final, like a quiet declaration no one else would bother to listen to. Behind me, a burst of sound split the air. Fireworks, small but loud, shot up above the garden, scattering gold sparks across the sky. Guests oohed and awed as the bursts reflected off the Pacific. Madison squealed with delight. Of course she had added fireworks, something to capture for her video, something to make the moment even more about her. The last spark cracked open above the water, and with it, whatever part of me was still holding the day together finally gave way. I blinked hard, trying to fight back the tears pushing up my throat, but they spilled anyway, warm against the cold afternoon wind. I turned away from the lawn completely. The service gate was propped open with a catering bin. I pushed past it, moving down the quiet side pathway that wrapped around the estate. The music and laughter faded behind me, with every step replaced by the hum of distant traffic on the coastal road. By the time I reached the parking lot, my breath was shaking. A single gull screeched overhead, circling above the cars, as if mocking me for running from my own wedding. My vision blurred again, and I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand. I pressed my palm to the handle of my car, but paused. Was I really doing this? Leaving my wedding. Leaving everything. But when I inhaled, I expected to feel guilt, panic, shame. Something powerful enough to hold me still. Instead, there was only quiet. A strange, solid quiet in the center of my chest. I opened the door. I slid inside. I placed both hands on the steering wheel and took one long, steadying breath. And with that breath came a certainty I had never tasted before. I wasn't going back. Not for apologies, not for explanations, not for their version of love. The engine hummed to life beneath me. I wiped my last tear, shifted into gear, and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the fireworks, the music, the guests, and the version of myself they always tried to control behind the cliffs of Seabreeze Estate. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not once. The drive down Highway 1 felt unreal, like I was floating through someone else's life. The cliffs curved along the coastline, the waves crashing below in a rhythm that didn't match the chaos still trembling inside me. My old sedan rattled every time I hit a bump, the air conditioner barely blowing anything but warm air. Yet it was the first place I'd breathed freely all day. By the time I reached Monterey, the sun had dipped low enough to stain the sky in shades of burnt orange and lavender. I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the apartment complex I used to drive past in college. Back then, I thought anyone who lived here was barely holding on. Now I understood what barely holding on looked like, and somehow it didn't feel as shameful as it once had. I rented a studio unit on the second floor. The landlord, an older man with a limp, didn't ask many questions. He pushed a clipboard toward me, and I signed the lease with the same steady hand I'd used to sign away my wedding just hours earlier. Inside, the room smelled faintly like old carpet and microwaved noodles. The walls were thin, the kitchenette ancient, the bathroom cramped. But it was mine. Mine in a way nothing had been in years. I sat on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in thin plastic and stained on one corner, and let the silence settle over me until I could breathe again. The next morning I woke before sunrise, pulled my hair into a tight ponytail, and drove down to the Monterey Shores Inn, a dated seafoam green hotel perched a block from the beach. A help wanted sign hung in the window. The manager, a woman named Beth who looked exhausted but kind, slid an application toward me. "We start everyone in housekeeping," she said. "Pay's not great, but hours are steady." "That's fine," I answered. And I meant it. She glanced at my wedding dress perfect manicure, at the blouse that still smelled faintly of perfume, at the fact that my shoes were nicer than anyone else's in the lobby. "You sure?" she asked. "Yes." My voice didn't waver. I started the next day. From the moment I walked into the laundry room, reality hit me in a way nothing else had. The industrial washers roared like jet engines. The floor was always slick, the heat suffocating. The air smelled of bleach mildew and old towels no amount of detergent could fully save. I scrubbed showers until my knees ached. I stripped sheets stained with things I didn't want to identify. I vacuumed carpets that coughed up sand from summers long gone. I pushed carts so heavy my shoulders burned every night. I learned to clean 10 rooms in under 4 hours. I learned the exact angle to flip a mattress without wrenching my back. I learned what exhaustion felt like when it settled into bone. But I also learned the staff's rhythm, the systems they followed, the shortcuts that cost them time instead of saving it. I noticed when the front desk lost track of room readiness because housekeeping didn't update the internal system fast enough. I noticed the way guests consistently complained about long waits. I noticed how the cleaning supplies were stored inefficiently, how the inventory sheets were wrong, how much time was wasted between shifts, because no one had ever taught the staff another way. The more I observed, the colder the knot in my chest became, but not the way it hurt at the wedding. This was a different kind of tightness, something focused, something awake. After 2 weeks, I started quietly reorganizing. I created a color-coded checklist and taped it inside the housekeeping cart. I streamlined the linen storage, sorting it so anyone could grab items in seconds instead of minutes. I offered to help the front desk match their logs with our real-time progress. At first, the staff rolled their eyes. I didn't blame them. People in nice clothes had probably tried to fix things before, without lifting a finger. But when they realized I was carrying the heaviest laundry bags, scrubbing the worst rooms, staying late to help night shift, their resistance softened. A month in the change became noticeable. Guests started complimenting the cleanliness. Check-in times got shorter. The review page on the hotel website shifted from annoyed 2-star comments to polite 3 stars, then grateful 4 stars. One afternoon, Beth called me into her office. I walked in still wearing my uniform, smelling like bleach and dryer sheets, hair stuck to my forehead after a long double shift. She shut the door behind me. "Sit," she said, pointing at the chair across from her desk. She rifled through a pile of papers before settling on a printed stack. "You've been messing with my systems." My stomach tightened. She lifted a hand. "I'm not mad." She slid the papers forward. "Guest satisfaction scores are up 30% this month." I blinked. 30-30, she repeated. "And after talking to the staff, it seems like you're the reason." I didn't know what to say. She leaned back in her chair. "Where did you learn all this?" The truth pressed against the back of my teeth. I was raised in luxury hotels, groomed for social climbing, born into a world that taught me everything except how to be seen. But I couldn't say any of that. "Just paying attention," I murmured. Her eyes softened. "Well, you made a difference. And I want you to know I see it." I didn't expect the words to hit as hard as they did. My throat tightened. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Not without strings attached. Not without reminding me of my family name. Not without comparing me to Madison. Being recognized for what I actually did. What I worked for felt like someone handing me a piece of myself I didn't realize had been missing. When I stepped back outside into the late afternoon air, the ocean breeze brushed my face, carrying the smell of salt and possibility. I walked across the parking lot, slowly breathing in new life with every step. That night I sat in my tiny apartment with a notebook open on my lap. I drew charts, wrote numbers, tracked expenses, set goals I had never dared to write down before. I wasn't the bride who walked away from her wedding anymore. I was someone rebuilding herself from the ground up, 1 room, 1 shift, $1 at a time. And for the first time in years, the path in front of me didn't feel impossible. It felt like mine. The idea of building something of my own came quietly, the way dawn creeps in before the sun breaks the horizon. One night in early 2017, I sat at my kitchen table in my tiny Monterey apartment, surrounded by half-finished notebooks of checklists and scribbled diagrams. The floor shook every time the neighbors' kids ran down the hall, and the refrigerator hummed loud enough to drown out my thoughts if I sat too close. Still, for the first time in years, the noise didn't bother me. I was working towards something that felt real. I had saved every extra dollar for months, tips from guests' overtime from double shifts, the holiday bonus. Beth insisted on giving me, despite how tight the hotel budget was. I walked into a local credit union and applied for a small business loan, with my palms sweating so hard I nearly smudged the paperwork. They approved me for less than I hoped, but more than I expected. The next week I found an old, run-down 3-story motel along Lighthouse Avenue. The paint peeled in strips, the roof sagged, and the rooms smelled like old cigarettes and despair. But when I walked through the empty hallways, I felt something settle inside me. It had good bones. It had potential. And unlike the wedding venue I had fled, this place could become something that belonged entirely to me. I signed the lease with a shaky pen and whispered under my breath, "Let's try." Renovations started immediately. I spent long nights stripping wallpaper, painting walls, hauling out carpets that left my arms covered in dust. I watched YouTube videos on how to install light fixtures. I sketched out room layouts at 2 a.m, experimenting with sustainable materials and minimalist designs. I made mistakes. I broke a faucet my first week. The electricity shorted twice. The contractor I hired quit unexpectedly. But every time something went wrong, I figured out how to fix it or who to call. I chose the linens myself, comparing thread counts and textures under fluorescent lights. I built a welcome package for guests that focused on local artisans and eco-friendly amenities. I wanted every detail to feel intentional, thoughtful, things my family had never bothered to notice. I hired a team of 4, a front desk clerk named May, a housekeeper named Rosa, a maintenance guy named Glenn, and a college student named Drew, who worked part-time. We spent the first opening week eating takeout on the lobby floor between shifts. They trusted me, even when I was improvising every other step. 6 months later, the rooms were almost always full. A travel blogger posted a review calling it a hidden gem of the Monterey coast, and suddenly the phones rang non-stop. Guests complimented the design, the comfort, the warmth of the service. I reminded myself daily that this wasn't luck. This was work. Mine. One afternoon, a local lifestyle magazine asked to interview me for a feature on new boutique hotels, revitalizing the area. I nearly laughed when the editor said, "We love your story." My story. Not my sister's. Not my parents'. Mine. I framed the magazine page and hung it in the office where only staff could see it. It was enough. By 2019, I had saved enough to open a second location near Carmel Valley. This time the process moved faster. I negotiated better sourced, smarter delegated more. The team grew not just in size, but in loyalty. They believed in Harper & Company, hospitality, something I had built from scratch. The second hotel's opening week sold out. Guests emailed days before arrival, asking for special add-ons and early check-ins. A well-known travel site listed us as one of California's most promising new boutique brands. In 2021, I opened the 3rd property near Big Sur. This one was special. Wood, glass, and stone nestled against the cliffs. It was the kind of place I once imagined getting married. The irony wasn't lost on me. During the design phase, I met Ethan Cole. He walked into my office carrying a portfolio of sustainable architectural concepts and a calm energy that felt like an uncluttered room. His ideas weren't flashy. They were thoughtful, warm, grounded. He respected what I wanted, asked questions. Listened. Really listened. We spent long days touring lumber yards, comparing tile samples, trying to find the right balance between modern and natural. Sometimes we worked until the sun set behind the cliffs, and he'd bring 2 coffees from a shop nearby. He always handed me the cup without asking my order. It didn't take him long to figure it out. One evening, while reviewing the plans under the dim office lamp, he looked at me and said, "You know, most people don't build places with this much heart." I pretended to focus on the blueprint, but the compliment warmed something inside me that had been cold for years. We grew close, but neither of us rushed anything. There was too much healing I still needed to do. Too much rebuilding of myself. But having someone who looked at me with clarity, not comparison, was its own kind of gift. The 3rd hotel opened during a warm June morning with the ocean mist rolling in behind us. The first guests who walked through the doors gasped at the cliffside views, and I realized I had created something far larger than survival. I had built a life. A real one. The hotels continued to thrive. I hired more staff, created mentorship programs, partnered with local businesses. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a community that valued effort over image. Then, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. I was sitting in the office of the Big Sur property, sorting through invoices when Drew walked in holding his phone. "Harper," he said, "you need to see this." He handed it to me. An article was pulled up on a regional business site. Ocean Crest Resort faces financial troubles amid internal board disputes. My heart stuttered. Ocean Crest. The place where I lost myself. The place where my wedding had been rewritten, repurposed, and stripped bare. The place where my family stood under fireworks while I drove away alone. My eyes scanned the article. Talk of unpaid debts, board arguments, possible foreclosure. A line at the bottom mentioned the resort might soon be listed for sale if the board couldn't resolve its issues. Something deep inside me stirred, subtle but definite, like a whisper rising from the ocean floor. "This is your opening." My pulse quickened. A strange mix of adrenaline fear and a sense of déjà vu washed over me. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was reckless. Maybe it was fate. But looking at that headline, I felt the quiet shift of a door opening somewhere in the dark. A door I realized I was ready to walk through. The headline stayed with me long after I left the office. It echoed through the drive back to Monterey, through the climb up the apartment stairs, through the quiet of my living room, where the only sound was the refrigerator humming in uneven spurts. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept replaying the wedding, the fireworks, the whispers, the way I walked out barefoot with my heels abandoned on the stone steps. And then the image of Ocean Crest, cracking, faltering in trouble. By sunrise, the decision felt inevitable. I called Nolan Reyes at 8 sharp. He was a corporate attorney I'd met through a business workshop the year prior. Sharp mind, calm voice, a tendency to ask the exact questions I wasn't ready to answer. When he picked up, he sounded surprised. "Harper." "Everything, Kay." "I want to buy Ocean Crest Resort," I said, pacing the kitchen tile. A pause. "Isn't that the place? From before?" "Yes." I stopped pacing. "And I want the sale to be anonymous." Nolan exhaled slowly. "Then we'll need a holding company. A clean one. No obvious ties." "Are you sure you want to do this?" "No." "Yes. Maybe. Completely. I'm sure." 2 days later, I sat inside a polished glass-walled law office in downtown Monterey. A holding company had been formed. Wavefront Holdings, LLC, named after nothing meaningful, which was exactly the point. My name didn't appear anywhere. The signatures were layered through trusts and sub-entities until the ownership trail looked like a maze built to confuse anyone who wasn't paid to solve it. The seller's representatives filed in with stiff smiles and polite resignation. Their board had been fighting for months, losing money even faster. They wanted out. They wanted someone who could clean up the mess. The conference room smelled faintly of leather and printer ink. Papers slid across the table. The purchase contract, property disclosures, renovation obligations. $22.8 million. The number stared up at me like a dare. My heart thudded hard enough to shake my ribs, but my hand didn't tremble. I signed. Once. Twice. Again. Page after page. Something steadied inside me with each pen stroke. Nolan nudged the renovation addendum forward. $7.4 million for repairs and updates, he said quietly. You'll have full creative control. Full control. Something I'd never had under my own roof growing up. When the seller shook my hand, I held his gaze. A strange electricity settled along my spine. This wasn't like opening a boutique hotel. This wasn't business expansion. This was reclaiming soil I'd once been buried under. We finalized the deal before noon. By late afternoon, Nolan returned with a thick folder. There's something else, he said. I had my team run a preliminary audit of the resort's financial history. He opened the file. Charts, spreadsheets, red flags. There are irregularities in the operating budget, he continued. Funds diverted into odd expense categories. Multiple approvals from the same executive. I'd suggest digging deeper. I stared at the numbers, a cold awareness settling in. The timelines overlapped with the years when my parents proudly hosted events at Ocean Crest. It wasn't proof of anything, but the possibility flickered like a warning. "Do we investigate?" he asked. Yes. That night, I drove to Ocean Crest alone. The parking lot lights buzzed softly, illuminating a landscape I knew far too well. The resort looked both exactly the same and entirely different now that it belonged to me. Palms swayed under the breeze. The stucco walls glowed a soft cream in the moonlight. And the courtyard, the same one where my wedding ceremony had unraveled, stood quiet and empty. I walked slowly, letting each memory surface Madison posing for photos in her white gown. The fireworks exploding overhead the moment I left without looking back. The air tasted the same. Salt fog and the faint scent of whatever flowers had bloomed in April every year. But the feeling in my chest was nothing like before. This time, I wasn't the girl trying to belong. This time, I was the owner. Inside the lobby, the overnight desk clerk startled as I entered. "Sorry," he said quickly. "We're closed for renovation hours." "It's okay." I stepped forward. "I'm Harper, the new owner." His eyes widened. "Oh, wow, welcome. Do you need a tour? Eventually? Tonight I just want to walk." He nodded and slipped into the staff room, leaving me alone. The floor tiles echoed under my steps as I moved deeper into the building. I ran my fingers along the old wooden banister. The grooves were familiar. Everything was familiar, yet entirely different under my hand. On the second floor, I found the ocean-facing suite. Room 214. My family had stayed there every summer, hosting dinner parties that made the resort staff roll their eyes when they thought no one noticed. I remembered sitting on the balcony as a teenager, watching the waves, wondering if life outside our perfectly polished image could ever feel real. I stepped inside now, the room half stripped for renovation. Dust sheets covered the furniture. The balcony door creaked when I pushed it open. The sea breeze hit me cool and honest. This was where my mother once lectured me about posture. This was where my father taught Madison how to command a room. This was where I learned how small a person could feel inside their own skin. But not anymore. When I turned back toward the hallway, a woman stood near the threshold. A little startled arms folded, watching me. She had short, dark hair, sharp eyes, and the steady posture of someone who'd learned how to survive in places that overlooked her. "Ms. Lane?" she asked. "Yes," I said softly. "You must be Olivia Brooks." "I got your message," she replied. "You said you wanted to meet tonight." I nodded. "I want you to run this place." She blinked, taken aback. Me. "You know this resort better than anyone. And you know what's wrong with it better than anyone." Her expression shifted, something like disbelief, then relief, then a guarded hope. "I won't sugarcoat it," she said. "This place is a mess. Years of mismanagement. Staff morale is low. Guests complain about everything from plumbing to service. It'll take a miracle to turn it around. Not a miracle, I said. Just someone who cares. Someone who sees what needs to be done." She hesitated. "And you think that's me?" I held her gaze. "I know it is." A long silence stretched between us. Then she exhaled, slow and steady. "Okay," she said. "Let's rebuild it." It was the first moment that felt like alignment, an anchor dropping in a shifting tide. After Olivia left, I walked toward the courtyard one last time. The moon sat high above the Pacific, bright enough to cast shadows across the flagstone. I stood in the center of it, breathing in the night air, letting the weight of the past settle and transform into something sharper. Not bitterness, not grief, resolve. This place had taken something from me once. Now it would be the place where I rewrote everything. I wasn't ready to confront my family yet, not until the time was right. But time was moving, and so was I. When I stepped out into the cool night and locked the door behind me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My return wasn't a question anymore. It was a countdown. Saturday morning at Ocean Crest began like any other. Until Olivia stepped into my office with a tablet clutched to her chest and an expression that told me she needed my attention immediately. "They submitted a reservation request at 6:45 this morning," she said, tapping the screen and angling it toward me. "Lane, all 4 names, requesting the Grand Seabreeze Hall for their annual charity brunch. The same charity brunch they once bragged was too prestigious to host anywhere but private estates and coastal clubs. The same brunch that used to be Madison's favorite opportunity to pose for the local society pages. For a moment, something cold and electric slid down my spine. Not fear, not anger. Something more like alignment. Like watching a cycle return to the one place it could finally break. I stepped closer to the surveillance console, and brought up the reservation overview. Their names blinked in bold letters, innocent and unknowing. I felt a quiet pull in my chest, that strange sensation of a loop closing. This is where it ends. This is where it begins. Keep everything standard, I told Olivia. No upgrades, no downgrades. Serve them like any other clients. Understood. She hesitated. Should I tell the staff who they are to you? No, I said. Not yet. She nodded and left the room. I stayed at the console longer than I needed to, staring at their reservation, watching the blinking status bar like it was a countdown. It felt surreal to stand in the same building I had once fled barefoot, now prepared to host the same people I had been running from. By 10 o'clock, the front drive cameras blinked awake with motion detection. A black SUV rolled up first, polished enough that I could see distorted reflections of the palm trees in the hood. A second SUV followed, then a third, all of them spotless. The doors opened in coordinated sequence like a staged entrance. My mother Elaine stepped out with oversized sunglasses masking half her face, her hair in that same flawless twist she'd worn at my wedding. She scanned the resort with a critical tilt of her head, the same expression she used when deciding whether a dress was worth keeping. My father, Walter, exited the second vehicle, adjusting his blazer, as if preparing for a press conference. His posture looked heavier than I remembered, but it was Madison who drew my eye. She stepped out last, her outfit curated and expensive, but failing to hide the exhaustion embedded around her eyes. Even through the screen, I could see the veneer cracking. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, the screen lighting up with notification after notification, emails she didn't want anyone to know about. I zoomed the camera in slightly and caught a preview line. Partnership discontinued, effective immediately. Another ping. We regret to inform you. Her jaw tightened. She shoved the phone into her bag and forced a bright influencer smile. My breath stilled. The world she'd always believed belonged to her was slipping away, and she was walking straight into the one place she'd never expect to face the truth. Downstairs, the staff lined up in the lobby as they always did for VIP arrivals, not because the lanes were special, but because Ocean Crest's standards required it. I had insisted those standards remain unchanged for every guest. I watched from the office unseen. Elaine entered first, pausing only long enough to frown at the new decor, a modern blend of sand tones and natural textures that replaced the old gaudy gold accents she used to love. This looks nothing like last year, she said, pulling off her sunglasses. It's been improved, Olivia replied with her professional smile. Elaine hummed, unimpressed. Improved is one word for it. Madison's phone chimed again. She ignored it, raising her own camera instead. Hey guys, she said, striking a pose. Back at the stunning Ocean Crest Resort getting ready for our big charity brunch. Stay tuned for a full lifestyle update. She angled the lens toward the lobby mural. Though, the aesthetic is a little different. Not sure it fits my brand anymore. But we'll make it work. I almost laughed. This lobby wasn't designed to fit Madison's brand. It wasn't designed to fit anyone's ego. It was designed to be a place that welcomed people who appreciated authenticity, something my family had never cared for. Walter approached the reception desk next, flipping through a binder he'd brought for reasons only he understood. We usually have early access to the event hall. Can someone take us down? I'm happy to check availability, the receptionist said. We're following standard policy today. Walter raised an eyebrow. Standard policy. We're not standard guests. Today, everyone is. Olivia replied calmly. I swallowed a knot of tension, grateful for her steady presence. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. Can we talk to the owner? If we're going to promote this place, it needs to match our level. This lighting alone is going to make content impossible. Promote. Olivia echoed, careful but firm. Are you requesting a collaboration? Obviously, Madison scoffed. I mean, look at me. I have a platform. This resort could use some serious exposure. Honestly, I'm not convinced it even deserves to be part of my brand anymore, but maybe we can negotiate something. The receptionist shot Olivia a panicked look. Should I call the owner? He whispered. Olivia glanced subtly at the camera, at me. My finger hovered over the zoom control. I felt my lips tilt into the faintest smile. Not yet. Let me see if the owner is available, Olivia said quietly. I could almost feel the universe folding inward. Every insult, every dismissal, every time they looked through me instead of at me, slowly aligning in a single line that pointed straight toward this moment. On the screen, Madison adjusted her coat, trying to fix a strand of hair that refused to fall right. Her confidence flickered brief and telling. Elaine fussed with her purse, scanning the lobby for someone important enough to greet her. Walter paced with his binder, muttering about operational standards slipping. They had no idea the ground beneath them was shifting. I stood in the shadows of the office, pulse steady, watching my past walk blindly into the doorway of my present. The moment I would have to step out and face them was coming, closer with every breath. But for now, I watched. I observed their entitlement, their cracks, their unraveling edges, and I waited for the exact second the truth would hit them so hard it split the air. That moment wasn't here yet, but it was close enough to taste. Olivia's voice came through my office door before she even knocked, tight and urgent. "They're escalating," she said as she stepped inside. "Your mother is demanding a complimentary VIP suite. She said if we don't honor their legacy, she'll file a formal complaint and tell the Monterey Business Guild we've gone downhill." Of course she would. "And your father," Olivia continued, "is yelling at the event staff about the floral arrangements. He keeps insisting they're not up to the Caldwell standard." I exhaled slowly, my pulse beginning to thrum beneath my skin. I wasn't afraid, just aware that the moment I'd been walking toward for years was finally standing on the other side of a thin wall. "Harper," Olivia said, lowering her voice, "the board is here. They want to speak with the owner. They said this brunch is damaging the resort's image. We can't delay." I rested my hands on the back of the chair. The leather felt cool under my palms even as heat rose in my chest. My heart pounded once hard enough to make my ribs lift, but my mind was clear. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "It's time." I chose a simple, navy dress, clean lines, no embellishment. Something strong without being loud. I pulled my hair back neatly. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman who walked out of her wedding. I saw someone who knew exactly who she had become. Then I left the office and walked down the hallway with a steady, deliberate pace. The closer I got to the Grand Seabreeze Hall, the louder the noise became. Raised voices, clattering trays, the brittle sound of my father's frustration echoing off marble walls. Paused at the doorway, invisible for a moment, taking everything in. Thomas stood at the center of the chaos jaw, clenched, pointing at the staff arranging the buffet table. "Who approved this layout?" he barked. "Ocean Crest always used a double-arch entrance for this event." "Who changed that? Who decided on these second-rate pastries?" "This is unacceptable," his voice boomed across the hall. My mother hovered near the bar, dabbing under her eyes like she'd been personally wronged by the lighting. Madison filmed herself near one of the floral displays, her voice bright but strained. I stepped forward. The room didn't notice me at first, but the staff did. One by one, postures straightened. Conversations fell away. Olivia appeared at my side, giving me a small nod that carried more weight than words. Then she raised her voice, not loud, but clear, slicing through the noise. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Before you speak to my team again, allow me to introduce someone important." Thomas turned, exasperated. "If it's the catering director, tell them." "It's not the catering director," Olivia said sharply. "It's the owner." That single word stilled the entire hall. The clinking glasses stopped. Madison lowered her phone. My mother straightened, eyes narrowing. A hush spread like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Olivia stepped aside. And there I was. Every breath in the room seemed to pause. Thomas blinked slowly, confusion turning to disbelief. "Harper." My mother's arms froze mid-gesture, her face tightening just enough to betray the panic beneath her composure. Madison's jaw dropped, her phone slipping slightly in her grip, as if even her curated persona didn't know how to react. I held their eyes one by one. "Good morning," I said calmly. My voice carried cleanly across the hall, steady, unshaken. I walked forward, not rushing, owning each step like the space had always been mine. The staff parted respectfully. The board members near the entrance straightened as if they already understood what was happening. I turned toward the guests who had gathered early, offering a polite but brief smile. "Thank you all for joining us today," I said. "I'm Harper Lane, the new owner of Ocean Crest Resort. I hope you enjoy your event." It was simple, controlled. Enough. Inside, something warm and fierce pressed against my ribs. The feeling of reclaiming pieces of yourself you thought had been lost forever. Behind me, Madison let out a shaky laugh. "You," she said, voice pitching upward. You own this place. That's, wow. That's funny. Her hand trembled so visibly she had to lower the phone. My father stepped forward, face flushed. How long has this been going on? How did you even... I met his glare without flinching. Long enough. Evelyn tried to gather herself, smoothing her blouse, forcing a tight smile toward the nearest guests. This must be some misunderstanding, she murmured. Harper doesn't... She couldn't. Yes, I said evenly. I could, and I did. Their reactions hit me like a collage of old memories. My mother critiquing my posture, my father telling me not to try too hard, Madison stealing every spotlight without consequence. But seeing them now, stripped of certainty, felt like clearing a fog I'd lived in for most of my life. My father's mouth opened again, voice cracking with something dangerously close to desperation. Why would you buy this place? Why didn't you tell us I didn't look away? Because you never asked who I was becoming. I said, my voice quiet but sharp. You only ever asked who I was compared to her. A ripple spread through the room as people exchanged looks. Even the staff paused, holding their breath. Madison's face twisted a forced smile, returning as she tried to salvage her image. You should have told us sooner, she said quickly. We could have helped promote. You're not needed for that. Her smile faltered like a light flickering out. My mother finally stepped forward, chin lifted. Harper, we're family. This display isn't necessary. This isn't a display, I said. It's clarity. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't revel in their shock. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there steady and whole as the woman I'd spent years becoming. The woman they never expected to meet again. Certainly not here, not in a place they believed belonged to their social orbit. For the first time in my life, their reactions didn't define anything about me. I looked toward Olivia. Please continue assisting the guests. The brunch proceeds as scheduled. She nodded, turning to the staff with renewed confidence. As the room resumed its movement, my parents remained frozen, their carefully curated expressions slipping. Madison hovered beside them, biting her lower lip, her eyes darting between me and the phone she was now too shaken to raise. I took one step back, letting the truth settle in the space between us. This was the moment everything shifted. The moment the past finally collided with the present, and the moment the three people who had once shaped my world realized they no longer had any power in it. I didn't need to stay longer. The reveal was done. I turned, slightly poised to leave the hall. And for the first time since I'd fled barefoot from this place, I felt entirely, completely in control. Thomas moved toward me before I even reached the hallway. His steps sharp and uneven, like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to shout or grab my arm or simply demand the universe rewind itself to before he learned the truth. You blindsided us, he hissed, his face flushed a deep red. You blindsided your own family. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Yes, I said quietly. For the first time, it looks accurate. His nostrils flared. You've betrayed us, Harper. This resort is part of the Lane legacy, your legacy. You had no right to take it without consulting us. Lane legacy, I repeated. I didn't know we had one. Unless you mean the legacy of pretending everything is perfect, while everything underneath is falling apart. Madison rushed up beside him, mascara already smudging under her eyes. You always do this, she cried. You always take things away from me. First, my moment at your wedding. I stared at her. My wedding. She ignored the correction. And now you steal Ocean Crest just when I actually needed a place to get content again. Brands are watching me, Harper. You don't understand how fragile perception is online. Actually, I murmured. I understand it perfectly. Her face crumpled like paper. Walter jabbed a finger toward the lobby. This place is not yours. It belongs to this family. Your mother and I built our reputation here. We brought investors here, donors, dignitaries. You are disrespecting your blood. You disrespected me first, I said simply. The calm in my own voice surprised me. It wasn't the brittle calm of survival. It was something sturdier, something that didn't need permission. Behind us, several board members approached. 3 older men and a woman in her 50s with a name badge that read Executive Governance Council. Their expressions made it clear they'd heard enough of the shouting. Ms. Lane, the woman said politely to me, may we speak with you? Thomas cut in before I could answer. No, you should be speaking with me. This resort's standing has been tied to my family's involvement for over 20 years. The woman turned to him, her voice cool. And now, its standing is being threatened by your behavior this morning. A murmur rippled through the hall. Thomas stiffened, but she didn't give him time to recover. Your outbursts, your treatment of staff, and the escalating demands from your family have put us in an uncomfortable position. We require a meeting with the owner to address the reputational risk. She's not the owner. Thomas snapped. Not really. She used a shell company. This is an ambush. It's legal, I said. He spun toward me. You think legality is all that matters? No, I said. Truth matters too. His eyes narrowed. What truth? I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the thin folder Nolan had prepared, the one containing proof of financial irregularities in the resort's old operations. I'd hoped not to need it so soon. This truth, I said, handing it to the board representative. She opened it, brows rising as she skimmed the summaries. These are misallocated funds from the Ocean Crest Charity Initiative. Several withdrawals are signed by you, Mr. Caldwell. A hush swept through the space like a wind passing between bodies. Thomas stepped back, his voice cracking. This is ridiculous. Those funds were used for operational overflow. We hosted events dinners. Charity funds cannot be used for private functions, the woman interrupted. And certainly not without board approval. Madison clutched her phone tighter. Dad, she whispered. He ignored her, grabbing the folder from the board member and flipping through the pages in wild disbelief. These are fake. These signatures. Someone forged. They were verified, I said. Twice. Walter's face drained of color. One of the board members whispered something to another. The movement of it, quiet pointed, made Madison twitch. She fumbled for her camera like a reflex opening the livestream app without even thinking. I need to film this, she muttered. People need to know we're being targeted. Madison put the phone down. Evelyn snapped in a whisper that wasn't nearly soft enough. But Madison had already hit go live. Behind her, the board members continued murmuring, exchanging pages, pointing at dates that matched fundraising galas my parents once bragged about hosting. Her camera caught the tension, the disbelief, the humiliation blooming on her parents' faces. Someone gasped as the livestream clock ticked on. Someone else whispered, Is she really live right now? She was, and hundreds of followers were watching. My mother finally saw the red recording icon and lunged forward. Madison, turn that off. But the sudden motion jolted Madison's hand. The phone jerked upward, capturing her mother's strained face and her father's tightening jaw, capturing board members holding evidence of misused charity funds. Then her followers began commenting, not with support, but confusion, speculation, shock. Messages popped across her screen in bright, incriminating lines. Is your dad in trouble? Why is everyone yelling? What's happening at the brunch? This is messy. Madison's breath caught. Her face blanched. She tried to smile, tried to control the narrative, but the mask wouldn't stick. This isn't what it looks like, she stammered, blinking rapidly at her phone. Evelyn grabbed her wrist, shoving the phone down. Enough. Somewhere in the confusion, the board representative raised her voice. Mr. Caldwell. Until further investigation, we are asking you to leave the premises immediately. Your presence is now considered disruptive and detrimental to the resort's reputation. The words sliced the room open. A stunned silence followed. No, Thomas said, barely a breath. This isn't. Please gather your things, she repeated. When he didn't move, 2 security staff stepped forward, not aggressively, just firmly. Thomas shook his head, backing away as if the walls were collapsing around him. Harper, tell them this is some misunderstanding. Tell them you didn't mean to. I didn't do anything, I said softly. The truth is doing all the work. That sentence hit him harder than anything else. The board turned to leave, carrying the folder with them. Staff members tried to resume duties. Guests whispered. The air felt charged, sharp, alive. My mother stepped closer to me, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. Harper, she pleaded, don't let this get out any further. People talk. Reputations break. You know this world. Don't do this to us. I met her gaze with a steadiness I didn't know I possessed. I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm not spreading rumors. I'm not raising my voice. I'm not pushing anyone out. I'm just standing here. And the truth is taking care of the rest. Her bottom lip quivered. For the first time since I was a child, I saw fear in her eyes, not of me, but of losing the image she worshipped. And in that moment, something inside me settled. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still. Sometimes it simply refuses to look away. I turned from her, from all of them, letting the noise behind me swell, while I walked toward the quieter side of the hall. My pulse had steadied, my breath had evened, my world felt grounded again, and as the chaos continued without me, I realized the most surprising thing of all: I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt free. The hallway outside the Grand Seabreeze Hall buzzed with a muted mixture of confusion and gossip, but I slipped past it, letting the noise fade behind me. I needed air. Clean, cold air that didn't smell like wilted floral arrangements and the remains of a collapsing image. I walked toward the West Garden, the quietest part of Ocean Crest, where the wind from the Pacific always felt sharper, truer. I had barely reached the path when I heard someone call my name. Harper. I turned and saw Aunt Diane striding toward me, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun, her face flushed from exertion or emotion. Maybe both. She wasn't technically my aunt, more like my mother's cousin, but she had been the only person in my childhood who ever looked at me with softness. She reached me and pulled me into a quick, firm hug. "I got a call from a friend," she said breathlessly. She said the Caldwell family had a public unraveling at Ocean Crest. I thought she was exaggerating, but my God, Harper, what is happening? I let out a slow exhale. The truth happened. Diane's expression softened. Then it was long overdue. She touched my arm gently. "Walk with me." We moved through the West Garden, where coastal sage and lavender grew wild around the pathways. The ocean wind pressed against us, lifting strands of hair from our faces. It was cooler here, quieter. The chaos of the brunch felt a world away. When we reached the overlook, an old stone terrace facing the cliffs, Diane stopped. Her face shifted, the weight of something she had held for years settling in her eyes. "There are things you were never told," she said quietly. My stomach tightened, but I didn't interrupt. She took a steadying breath. "Your family didn't just face financial stress in 2012. They went bankrupt. Completely. Your father made a series of disastrous investments, and your mother spent more than they could afford trying to maintain their status. They hid it from everyone, including you." I felt the air shift around me. Pieces of old memories clicked into place, rearranging themselves in ways that suddenly made sense. Diane continued. "Your mother pulled you out of that scholarship in 2009 because they couldn't afford tuition for both girls. But she didn't want anyone to know. She told me they needed to invest in Madison, the one with real potential," she said. "They couldn't let people see that you were the one earning your opportunities." My breath caught. "She said you'd understand eventually." Diane whispered, "That you were the practical one, the one who didn't need attention." The wind whipped harder across the terrace. I stared at the sea as the truth settled like sand in a broken hourglass. It wasn't shock. Not really. It was something quieter, heavier. The confirmation of a suspicion I'd carried since I was 18 and too afraid to name. It was never my fault. They had chosen Madison. They had chosen image. They had chosen to let me disappear. A strange calm washed through me, steady and bittersweet. Behind us, footsteps crunched against the gravel path. Diane and I turned at the same time. Madison stood a few yards away. Her makeup streaked her eyes red, not from crying, but from the sheer force of rage barely held in. "So that's it," she snapped. "You're letting her fill your head with lies now." Diane stiffened. "Madison, you shouldn't be here right now." Madison ignored her completely. Her gaze locked on me like I was the last stable thing in her world, and she needed to tear it down. "You think you're so much better than us now?" she said, voice trembling. "You think you can just buy this place and suddenly everything our parents did is some big conspiracy against you?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say that. "You don't have to," she spat. "It's obvious. You think the world owes you something because you got your feelings hurt years ago. Well, congratulations, Harper. You finally have more money than me. Is that what you wanted?" "Did you want to win?" I stepped forward slowly. "I never wanted to compete with you." "Liar," her voice cracked. "All my life, Mom and Dad told me I'd be the one who made it, the one who shined, the one who had potential, and now everything is falling apart. My sponsors, my views, my career, and you just stroll back in acting like you're above everything." Her words were sharp, but beneath them was a desperation so raw it scraped at the edges. "This was supposed to be my year," she whispered. Then her face twisted, her hand darting toward a floral centerpiece set on a pedestal near the terrace. She grabbed it and threw it hard, the vase shattering against the stone with a violent crack. "You took everything from me," she screamed. Diane stepped between us. "Madison." "That's enough. This isn't Harper's fault." "Yes, it is," Madison shot back. Everything was fine until she came back with her stupid hotels and her stupid success and her money and her confidence. Her voice broke. She wiped her face aggressively, smearing what was left of her eyeliner. Footsteps pounded behind her. My parents rushing toward us, their faces tight with embarrassment. Walter pointed at Evelyn. "This is your fault. You always pushed Madison too hard. You made her believe she was untouchable." Evelyn scoffed, hair whipping in the wind. "Don't you dare blame me. You're the one who ruined the charity accounts. You're the reason we're being humiliated." "Well, maybe if you hadn't spoiled her. Don't put this on me." They spiraled fast, voices rising, accusations overlapping, years of resentment exploding in a messy public unraveling. A few guests peeked over from the patio. Staff paused discreetly near the garden doors. Even the ocean wind seemed to hold still for a moment. This was it. The collapse. The breaking open of the polished facade they'd spent a lifetime crafting. And I stood there, not triumphant, not vindictive, just done. Madison's sobs echoed between the stone walls. My father argued until his voice cracked. My mother clung to the last shreds of dignity she could gather. But even her facade was slipping. I looked at them the way I'd look at distant strangers in a story I'd once heard, but no longer remembered clearly. A sadness tugged at me, not for what they were doing, but for what they had never been capable of giving. Diane touched my shoulder gently. "You don't belong in this chaos anymore, sweetheart." She was right. I took one last look at the family that had defined so much of my pain, and realized none of it held me now. I had already walked away once, but this time I wasn't running. I was choosing myself. Nolan was waiting in my office when I returned, standing by the window with a stack of papers under his arm. The late afternoon light framed him like a silhouette, the ocean stretching beyond the glass in long silver streaks. He turned when he heard me enter. "I figured you'd come here." I closed the door behind me, leaning on it for a moment, letting the quiet settle around us. My pulse had softened. My breath wasn't shaking anymore. The chaos from the West Garden felt miles away, like a storm moving out to sea. Nolan held up the documents. "We need to talk about next steps. Specifically whether you want to file formal charges, pursue civil action, or release anything to the press. The charity misuse alone could be significant." I approached slowly, my heels clicking softly against the wood floor. "I don't want to go public," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You're sure?" "Once the board gets involved, people may talk. If you want to control the narrative." "I'm not interested in narratives. Or revenge campaigns." I sank into the chair behind my desk. "I just want this handled legally. Quietly. No headlines." "But you'd win public sympathy," he pointed out. "You'd have every justification." "I know," I said. "And that's exactly why I don't want it." He lowered the documents, his expression easing. "Most people in your situation would go scorched earth." I shook my head. "I've lived in scorched earth. That was their world, not mine." He didn't argue. He simply took a seat across from me, respect clear, in the way he folded his hands. "I'll move forward with the internal filing," he said. "Nothing beyond what the law requires." "Thank you." He nodded once, then added, "And for what it's worth, you handled today with more grace than I've ever seen in a negotiation room." After he left, I sat with the silence, comfortable, steady mine. For years, I thought power meant being loud enough to be heard over the people who overshadowed me. I thought justice meant mirroring their cruelty. But now, watching the sun drift behind the horizon, I felt something else settle into my bones. Letting go was its own kind of strength. Later that evening, I made my way to the spa wing, which was still under renovation. Tools were scattered across the floor, paint samples taped to the walls. The air smelling like cedar and new beginnings. Ethan was crouched near one of the future treatment rooms, marking measurements with a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when I stepped inside. "Rough day." I let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You could say that." He stood, brushing sawdust off his jeans. I heard, "Things got loud." That's one word for it. I walked deeper into the room, trailing my fingers along the unfinished doorframe. "But it's done now, and I'm not adding fuel to anything. I don't need to." He leaned against the counter, watching me with quiet understanding. So what's next? I hesitated, then said, I've been thinking about this building. About turning part of it into something more than a spa. More. His brows lifted. A training center, I said, for young people in hospitality, kids who never had a chance to learn the industry, kids like I was before Monterey Shores Inn. Ethan's face softened. That's incredible, Harper. I want to give them real skills. I continued the idea gaining momentum in my chest. Front-of-house training, management pathways, mentorship. A place that isn't about image, but opportunity. He nodded slowly. You're building something bigger than a resort. I shrugged lightly. Maybe I'm just trying to become someone I needed 10 years ago. He held my gaze for a long moment, something warm flickering between us. Then he smiled gently. I'll help you design it, whatever you need. That warmth spread through me, settling somewhere deep. Before leaving the spa wing, I checked my phone and saw a new notification from the Ocean Crest internal system. A digital approval form waiting for my signature. A routine operational update. Except this one wasn't routine at all. It was the updated VIP roster, the same roster that, under previous ownership, automatically placed the Caldwells at the top. I opened it. Their names were still listed, unchecked waiting. A part of me hesitated. A familiar muscle memory urging me to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to not provoke further drama. But that was the voice of the girl who had walked out of her wedding barefoot and broken, not the woman standing here now. I clicked remove. All 4 names disappeared instantly. I added a short note for the administrative team. Effective immediately. The Caldwell family is no longer eligible for VIP privileges. No exceptions. Then I signed it, officially, unapologetically. Finally. A soft sound echoed from the hallway, heels clacking sharply against the floor. Evelyn. I didn't turn at first. I didn't want her voice to be the next thing to fill this room. But she came closer anyway, her tone breathless, urgent. Harper. She approached like someone trying to gather the pieces of a shattered vase. We need to talk. What happened today went too far. People are talking. They're misinterpreting everything. I'm not interested, I said without raising my voice. She blinked, visibly thrown off. You don't mean that. I do. She stepped closer. We can fix this. We can present a united front to the community. If you just meet with me. No, I said. There is no front. There is no we. Her face tightened, the mask slipping. You're making a mistake. I turned to look at her fully. No, I'm ending one. The silence that followed was ice cold, cutting cleanly between us. She opened her mouth again. Maybe to plead, maybe to scold. But I had already turned away. When I walked down the hallway alone, something subtle shifted inside me. The lights seemed softer, the air quieter, the floor steadier beneath my steps. The place that once haunted me now felt like the foundation of a life I had built with my own hands. A life untouched by their expectations. A life finally, completely, undeniably mine. I reached the end of the hall and paused, listening to the distant echo of waves against the cliffs. For the first time since the day I left this resort barefoot, I felt bass in my chest instead of fear. And peace, even more than justice, was what I had been chasing all along. The sky over Pacific Grove shifted into shades of gold and rose by the time I stepped onto the rooftop terrace of Ocean Crest. The staff had strung soft lights along the railing, and the glow skimmed across the surface of the ocean far below. The air carried a hint of salt and cool evening wind, clean, open, unburdened. Voices drifted around me, laughter from the kitchen team, quiet conversations from front desk staff leaning against the bar, clinking glasses as people toasted to another successful season. We were hosting a small appreciation gathering for the employees, nothing fancy, nothing scripted, just a group of people who had helped rebuild a place that once symbolized so much pain for me. Now it stood here as proof of something else entirely. I moved toward the far edge of the terrace, where the cliffs dropped into the water, and the sun brushed everything in warm amber. For a moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The world felt steady. It was strange standing in the same place where my life had shattered once. This resort, this coast, these cliffs, and realizing that it no longer owned a single piece of me. I had taken it back, and in doing so, I had taken back myself. Behind me, the celebration continued with easy joy. Someone turned on soft music, the kind that blended with the sound of the waves. Trays of appetizers circulated. People teased each other about shift mix-ups and shared stories from the summer rush. It felt like a family. Not the kind I was born into, but the kind I had chosen. I rested my arms on the railing and watched the last edge of the sun slip beneath the horizon. My mind drifted unspooling the path that led me here. The wedding I walked away from barefoot, the tiny apartment in Monterey, the bleach-scented hallways of the inn where I scrubbed floors to start over, the first hotel, then the second, then the third, the long nights building a life from scratch, the day I signed the papers and took ownership of Ocean Crest. This place that once made me feel small. Standing here now, I didn't feel small at all. Footsteps approached quietly. "You disappeared for a minute," Ethan said, stopping beside me. He held a glass of white wine in his hand, condensation sliding down the stem. "Thought I'd come find you." I took the glass when he offered it. Our fingers brushed briefly softly. "Just needed a second," I said. He leaned his elbows on the railing next to me. "You did something extraordinary today. You know that, right?" "I don't know about extraordinary," I murmured. "Necessary, maybe." "Necessary can be extraordinary," he said gently. I looked at him. His face was calm, open-edged by the melted colors of sunset. I felt something release quietly inside my chest. "You okay?" he asked. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Yeah," I said. "For the first time in a long time. I really am." We stood in silence together for a while, watching the horizon shift from gold to blue as the first evening stars blinked above the water. The sound of waves rose and fell like steady breathing. A comfortable quiet settled between us. Finally, he lifted his glass slightly in my direction. "To rebuilding," he said. I clinked mine gently against his. "To letting go," I replied. Our glasses touched with a soft chime, barely audible, but enough to seal something unspoken. When Ethan returned to mingle with the others, I stayed at the railing. Staff members waved up at me occasionally from the lower patio shouting thanks or raising their drinks. I smiled back, warmed by a deep, grounding gratitude. My parents weren't here. Madison wasn't here. Their absence didn't hurt. It gave me room to breathe. They had drifted out of my life over the last few weeks, fading like the last glow of sunlight behind a clouded horizon. There were no more phone calls, no messages, no apologies, just silence. A silence that once would have crushed me, but now I welcomed it. Some relationships aren't meant to be healed. Some endings aren't failures. Some doors are better left closed no matter who stands on the other side. Tonight, I wasn't mourning what I'd lost. I was celebrating what I'd gained. When the evening wound down, people lingered, laughing, eating, enjoying the warm coastal air. Someone lit candles along the banister, their small flames flickering in the breeze. I walked through the crowd, thanking each person individually. Their faces reflected pride and a sense of belonging I hadn't known growing up. Eventually, I circled back to the far end of the terrace, alone again with the ocean. The lights of Ocean Crest shimmered below me, scattering across the waves. The resort looked different from this angle. Alive, steady, warm. No longer a symbol of humiliation or loss. No longer a wound, a beginning, a life reclaimed, a future that belonged entirely to me. I took a long breath and let the air settle deep within me. Then I spoke softly, not to myself, not to the ocean, but to anyone who had ever stood where I once stood. Lost, silenced, unseen. If you're listening to my story, I hope it reminds you that walking away isn't weakness, it's courage. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself even when no one else understands. If you've ever stepped out of a toxic relationship or a family that didn't know how to love you right, I'd love to hear your story too. Share it. Let someone else know they're not alone. The wind brushed past me one last time, cool and gentle. I looked down at the lights of the resort reflecting across the water, a gentle shimmer stretching out into the night. For the first time since I left this place barefoot and broken, I felt whole. And as the final light faded into the sea, I knew with absolute clarity, this was my beginning, my freedom, my life, completely, finally, beautifully mine.